Welcome back to another Colors of Prog. And today I'm covering some progressive music from the Canterbury scene. First, let me mention that the Canterbury scene, or what became known as the Canterbury Sound, it's all complicated actually, but for a primer, essentially the beginnings of this musical scene centered around the city of Canterbury, Kent, England. And its prime period lasted from the late 1960s through the early 1970s, maybe a little later into the mid 1970s. And there are still some bands today still playing this sound of music. So, what is it? Well, loosely defined, it's improvisational sounding for the most part. Music that blends jazz, rock, psychedelia, and sometimes chamber music or classical music, and all these influences. But psychedelia is really a key point because a lot of these bands started out in the early psychedelic period. The music that predated, let's say Pink Floyd as we know it now, they were a heavily psychedelic band. A lot of these bands just mixed all these things up. They were gigging a lot, and in this particular area, Kent, England, and Canterbury, also known for lots of other things, including its famed buildings and of historical nature, as well as other things. These bands adopted this sound. It's sometimes it's been known, it's been called avant-garde in a way. But over time, the progressive rock listening community quickly adopted the sound under the wide umbrella of progressive rock. We all know progressive rock is this wide umbrella with bands that someone who says, well, that's not prog rock, and that's this, that's that. It's a wide thing. Quite often, many of the Canterbury scene bands contained overlapping personnel. By that, I mean that, and most of you know this if you're watching us, band members would be in several different bands at once, or would leave a band, join another band, come back to this other band, and shared personnel is quite often a thing. Some of the more well-known bands playing the Canterbury Sound were Camel, Caravan, Gong, Soft Machine, Hatfield in the North, National Health, and many, many more. Uriel, Uriel, was a heavily psychedelic band with some of the Canterbury influences in their sound. They actually gigged in London's famed Middle Earth Club. A lot of heavy rock and blues bands and heavy psychedelic bands played at the Middle Earth Club, including a lot of folk bands that also kind of edged into that whole psychedelic progressive folk thing too. Fairport Convention was one of the bands that played the Middle Earth Club. Very well-known club back in the mid to late 60s. Steve Hillage, later of Gong, and Dave Stewart, not the Eurythmics guitarist and keyboardist, were in Uriel. The record label that was interested in the band to record for them just had an issue with the name. So Uriel became Arzachel. I'm not even quite sure that the pronunciation of it. It's Arzachel, Arzachel. One lone album. It featured Hillage on guitars and vocals, Dave Stewart on organ, Montgomery Campbell on bass, vocals, and horns, and jazz-influenced drummer Clyde Brooks. And If nothing else, the Lone Arzachel album is the heavy psychedelic listen. Steve Hillage went back to school and then famously on off again, on again, off again, on again with Gong. Recent years, he's been touring with Steve Hillage's Gong. So that's very interesting. So basically, when Hillage left Arzachel, a trio, they rechristened themselves Egg. Yes, Egg. And the first Egg album is this. Released in 1970, it is most assuredly an interesting listen. Um, and if you've not heard of them, I think Gong fans would be very interested. It's the tunes are fairly short, but there's many of them, and some of them are broken up into movements. Hence the interest of the band members into classical music. So, like, there's Symphony Number 2, which is pretty much contains 4 movements, each about 3 to 4 minutes long. Is it an easy listen? It's the first album from Egg, and I just thought all those things that make the Canterbury, the makeup of the Canterbury sound are definitely sounds on this. And it's quite interesting. And again, I think Gong fans would really like it. The Polite Force was their second album, released in 1971, and is by far an improvement to me, with almost experimental Tangerine Dream-like keyboard sounds, courtesy of Dave Stewart. It's really amazing what this trio of young men accomplished in the span of 1 year between the release of the Egg debut album and the Polite Force. And it's funny, Canterbury sound bands are quite taken with strange song title names. A Visit to Newport Hospital. I mean, anyone's familiar with, especially Caravans, song titles. They could be quite unusual, to say the least. I quite like this album. And it's less aggressive and more easygoing to someone who's trying to listen to a different kind of music but doesn't want to be assaulted. So yes, I really like the Polite Force. If you look quickly, it looks like the Police Force, but no, it's called the Polite Force. The last album, The Civil Service, was released in 1974. It's this one. Yes, 3 years after the second album. Has a number of guest musicians, including returning Steve Hillage on guitar on a nearly 10-minute psychedelic workout. It's a pretty crazy song. The songs are longer for the first time ever on an Egg album. And there's less of that classical or chamber music influence, but it's still there, but it's a bit lessened, and it's more the jazz and the weird time signatures that we all know so well, and symphonic progressive rock, and there's a bit of that odd avant-garde thing. Hillage's song "Ring Out the Ground Loosely Now," whatever the hell that means, And Hillage himself has, for decades, been penning some strange songs with crazy titles. But it's a thing, right? The final album from Egg would seem probably more unusual and more so than the previous albums. I do like the second one myself personally, The Polite Force. I think one of the things I have issue with is Montgomery Campbell's singing voice. I'm not a big fan of that, of his singing voice. Nothing personal against the gentleman, but that was one of the things. And some of the Egg, the second and the third and final albums don't have many songs with vocal tracks. But when they're there, it just takes me out because I'm just not a fan of his singing voice. That being said, in between the second and third album, Dave Stewart did hook up with Steve Hillage, bass player Nick Greenwood, and drummer Pip Pyle, who was replaced by Eric Peachy. And both those guys were in Gong at different points in time. And they came up with a band called Khan, Khan. There's that very cool cover. Space Shanty was the album. And it's pretty out there, but it's also very listenable. It's very much more so than the Egg albums were, in a song structures, like they were trying to get played on the radio or in clubs at the time. Music clubs where bands played. Before the bands came on, there were DJs at the time, and pretty much like there are nowadays. And they would play music by the newer bands. And the funny thing was, this is their one and only album. It's quite unlike anything you've ever heard, but then a lot of this music is quite unlike anything you've ever heard if you're just listening to it for the first time. Toning down the evident space rock avant-garde leanings of Egg and Gong, Space Shanty has a band reaching for sometimes interesting sound, symphonic rock, clashing head-on with that Canterbury sound. But it helps too that Hillage and Nick Greenwood both have nice singing voices, very agreeable ones. And I actually highly recommend second Egg album and this. So if you've not heard them, although all the Egg albums are quite interesting, and if you could find them at a good price, I'd recommend them. So that's today's Canterbury Primer. There's a lot more about that Camel, Caravan, and episodes to come, as well as National Health and a couple of the other bands. And I mentioned Gong before in an earlier episode. There's a lot of Gong material out there, and Gong is Steve Hillage's version of Gong, and there's Kavis Tarabi's version of Gong, and both of them had played with David Allen, one of the original founder of the band. So there's a lot more to cover, but for now, hope you enjoyed this show, and that's pretty much it for today. And thank you for watching and listening.